Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today we are tackling something you might not expect. We're going to be talking about the impact of politeness on, how well those powerful AI systems, those LLMs that we all know and love, actually perform. So for this deep dive, we've got a research paper, and the title is Should We Respect LLMs? A cross-lingual study on the influence of prompt politeness on LLM performance.
Yeah, and it's a pretty fascinating study, actually. It kind of looks at how the way we actually phrase our requests, those prompts that we give to these large language models, can actually influence the quality of output we get back. It's kind of like how it is with people in everyday interactions.
I mean, yeah, it's almost like imagine you're asking an AI to write you a poem, right? Does it matter if you ask it super politely or just kind of, demand it? It turns out like it really does.
That's right. And the researchers actually took it a step further. They created 8 different levels of politeness in their prompts. I mean, they ranged from like super formal to pretty rude. And they wanted to see if there was like a sweet spot for politeness that led to the best performance.
Okay, so they've got these prompts, right? They've got different levels of politeness. What, like, exactly did they test them on?
Well, they focused on 3 key tasks that LLMs are often used for summarizing text, answering complex questions, and this is really interesting, detecting stereotypes.
Detecting stereotypes, huh? I mean, that sounds pretty important with all the concerns we hear about bias in AI.
Absolutely. And the findings in this area were actually quite revealing.
Yeah, so I mean, before we like dive into the findings, I have to ask, why might politeness even matter to an AI? I mean, it's not a person.
That's a really good question. The thing is, LLMs are trained on just massive amounts of text data, right? And that data, it includes all the nuances of human language, like the good and the bad, right? So they kind of end up reflecting our communication patterns, including, how we use politeness to express respect, build rapport, and even sometimes manipulate.
So you're saying it's like the AI is picking up on these social cues that are embedded in the language that it's been trained on?
Exactly, and that's why something like politeness, which we, might normally think of as this uniquely human trait, can actually have a measurable impact on how well an LLM performs.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, so I'm dying to know here, did they find that, like the more polite you are to these AIs, the better the results?
Well, it wasn't actually quite that straightforward. I mean, while being rude generally led to worse performance, there were some really interesting nuances. Like, they found that being overly polite, like using excessive flattery, it didn't actually necessarily improve results either.
So it's like there's a balance, like the AI has a sense of like what's appropriate, just like a person might.
I mean, yeah, that's a great analogy. The paper highlights, there's an anecdote in there where the LLMs, it seemed like they performed worse when they were given prompts that were either too casual or just like way over the top in their politeness. They responded best to a level of politeness that felt, I don't know, natural and respectful, not forced.
Interesting. Okay, so this is where I think it gets really interesting, right? They tested this across 3 different languages, right? English, Chinese, and Japanese. So did they find like any differences based on the language they were using?
Yes. Yeah, and they actually found that the sweet spot for politeness kind of varied across the languages, and it reflected cultural norms. So, for example, in English, GPT 3.5 scored like highest when it was given the most polite prompts possible. But in Japanese, the LLMs actually performed best with prompts that used more of a common level of politeness rather than overly formal language.
So it's not just about being polite, it's about being polite in a way that's culturally appropriate. I mean, that's amazing. It really shows how these models are absorbing not just the literal meaning of words, but like the cultural context too.
Right. And this has some pretty important implications for how we design and interact with LLMs in the future, too. But before we get into that, let's talk about how they measured the impact of politeness on detected stereotypes, because that's where things get really interesting.
So, you mentioned that they were looking at how politeness affected an LLM's ability to, detect stereotypes. How do they even measure that?
Yeah, so they used what they called a bias index, and this basically helped them quantify the level of stereotypical bias that was present in, like, the LLM's responses. So basically, a higher score on this bias index meant a greater reliance on stereotypes.
So a higher score like that, basically. So did they find that like politeness even had an effect on this bias index thing?
They did, yeah, and this is where I think some of the most surprising results kind of emerged. So in English, for example, GPT 3.5 actually showed the highest bias index when it was given a moderately polite prompt.
Wait, so being more polite actually led to, like, more bias in some cases? That seems kind of counterintuitive. You'd think, like, more politeness would encourage more neutral, like, less biased responses.
I know it's a really fascinating finding, right? The paper basically suggests that this might be because being overly polite might sometimes create like a relaxed environment where individuals and potentially LLMs as well, feel more comfortable expressing their true thoughts, even if, even if those thoughts are biased. So it's almost like the AI is letting its guard down when it perceives the interaction as like, overly friendly or something.
So you're saying if I want a truly, like, unbiased response from an LLM, I might be better off, like, using a neutral tone rather than being super polite? I mean, that's a game changer.
It is, yeah. It's definitely a nuance worth considering. I mean, it just highlights the fact that we're not just dealing with these simple rule-based systems, right? LLMs are complex, and they kind of, they reflect the often messy and unpredictable uh, nature of human communication, too.
This whole conversation about politeness and AI makes me think about, like, those training methods that we hear so much about, like RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, I think it's called. So is that, like, somehow influencing the way that LLMs respond to politeness?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely plays a role. The researchers, they actually explored this by comparing a fine-tuned LLM, which was Llama 2. They compared that with its base model that, it hadn't undergone that extra training with human feedback. And it's interesting, they found that both models were sensitive to the politeness levels of the prompts, but Llama 2, the one that had been fine-tuned with RLHF, it was even more sensitive.
Oh, wow. So it's like the RLHF is amplifying the AI's ability to pick up on, these social cues and then, like, respond accordingly.
Precisely. And that has some pretty significant implications for how we think about developing and deploying these LLMs in the future. It's not just about, feeding them data and expecting objective responses. We need to kind of be mindful of how our own communication styles, like our politeness and cultural nuances, are being absorbed and then like reflected back to us.
It's almost as if we're shaping the very nature of AI through, like, our interactions.
In a sense, yes. And that's why research like this is so important. It sheds light on that complex interplay between, human behavior and artificial intelligence. And that could really help us understand how to build more effective and responsible and perhaps, even more human-like AI systems.
I mean, it is incredible to think that something as human as politeness could have such a significant impact on how these, powerful AI systems operate. It really makes you kind of, wonder about the line between human intelligence and artificial intelligence.
It does kind of blur the lines, doesn't it? And I think as these systems, they become even more sophisticated and more integrated into our lives, that line it's just going to continue to get blurrier.
So if we're, essentially shaping AI through our interactions, like, what does that even mean for us as everyday users, of LLMs? Should I be thinking about my manners when I'm, chatting with ChatGPT?
It might sound a little strange, but yeah, I think being mindful of how you communicate with these LLMs could actually lead to better results. It's not just about what you're asking, but also, how you ask it.
So it's like we're developing a new kind of etiquette for the age of AI.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And it's not just about, getting better summaries or more, creative text generation. If we want AI systems that reflect our values, things like, fairness, respect, inclusivity, we need to model those values in the way we interact with them, with these AI systems.
That's a pretty powerful thought. By being mindful of how we communicate with AI, we might actually be, influencing its development in a positive direction. Who knew good manners could be so important in the world of tech?
And this research, they only focused on 3 languages, but imagine all the insights we might gain from exploring how politeness, manifests itself across all the diverse languages and cultures of the world.
It's mind-blowing to even think about all the possibilities. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive, and I think we've only just scratched the surface.
I think so too. It's an ongoing journey of discovery. But you've gained some really valuable insights today, and now you're better equipped to navigate this ever-evolving world of LLMs with a new understanding of, the power of politeness.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for joining us for another deep dive into this fascinating world where language and culture and artificial intelligence kind of they all intersect. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration of the ideas that are shaping our world.